Jane Eyre, final chapter. The next day, I went to look for Mr. Rochester. After a long journey, I arrived at Thornfield Hall. I walked for the last 2 miles to the house. I was excited. I was hurrying to see my old home again. The trees were the same. The road was the same. I arrived at the house and stopped. Stood and looked. It was terrible. Where was Thornfield Hall, my beautiful home? No one could live here anymore. Now I understood why Mrs. Fairfax never answered my letters. The walls of the house were still standing, but the windows were empty and dark, and there was no roof. The grass was long. There were no flowers in the garden. The broken walls of the hall were black and silent. The only sounds were the birds and the wind. Where was Mrs. Fairfax now? Where was little Adele? And where was Mr. Rochester? I hurried back to the village to find out. I asked a man in the village to tell me about Thornfield Hall.
No one lives there now, he told me. Last autumn, Thornfield Hall burned down. It was terrible. The house burned down in the middle of the night.
How did it happen? I asked.
They think Mr. Rochester's wife started it. Nobody ever saw her, but people say she was mad. People think she started a fire in her room in the attic. When it happened, the house was almost empty. Mr. Rochester was in the house, but the little girl, Adele, was away at school, and old Mrs. Fairfax was staying with some friends, many, many miles away. It seems that Mr. Rochester didn't want to see anybody at that time. People say he seemed very unhappy. They say that he wanted to marry a young woman, but she ran away.
Tell me about the fire, I said.
When the fire started, Mr. Rochester got all the servants out of the house. Then he went back in to save his wife. She was still in the attic, but she climbed up on the roof. I saw her there. She stood on the roof, shouting and waving her arms. Mr. Rochester tried to help her, but he could do nothing. Suddenly, she fell from the roof.
Did she die?
Yes, she did. She died immediately, and Mr. Rochester was very badly hurt. He couldn't get out of the burning house in time. When at last he came out, he was blind and he had lost one hand.
The man shook his head. So Mr. Rochester was still alive. He was hurt, but he wasn't dead. Suddenly, I began to hope again. I continued to question the man. Where does Mr. Rochester live now? I asked. Does he live in England?
Yes. He can't travel far, poor man. He lives at Ferndean, about 30 miles from here. It's a quiet place. He lives there quietly with 2 servants. He never has any visitors.
I decided to go to Ferndean at once. I arrived there just before dark. As I got near the house, the front door opened and a man came out. I knew at once it was Mr. Rochester, but he was very different now. He was still tall and strong, and his hair was still black, but his face looked very sad. He couldn't walk without help. At last, he turned and went sadly back into the house. The servant, Mary, who answered the door, knew me at once. She was very surprised to see me. I told her that I knew all about Mr. Rochester and the fire at Thornfield Hall. Tell Mr. Rochester that he has a visitor, but don't tell him who it is.
He won't see you, Miss Jane. He won't see anybody now.
I went into the room. "Who's there?" Mr. Rochester asked. "Is that you, Mary? Answer me. What's happening?" "Will you have some water?" I asked him. "Who's that? Tell me," he said. He was surprised and excited. "Mary knows me," I said. "I only came this evening." I took his hand. "Jane? Is it Jane? Jane, it's really you?" "Yes, it is. I'm so happy to be with you again. I'll never leave you, you know." "But Jane, where did you go? What happened to you? Why did you leave Thornfield Hall so suddenly? Why did you go away without any money? Why did you not stay and let me help you?" "You know why I left. I'm sorry. I'm sorry you were worried. But things are different now. I am a rich woman, and I've got 3 cousins." I told Mr. Rochester all about my cousins and my new home. "You don't need me now," he said. "But will you really stay with me?" There was hope in his voice again. "Of course I will," I said. "But you're young. You'll want to get married sometime, but not to me. I'm blind now, and I can't do anything. You won't want to marry me. You'll want to marry some young man. What's your cousin? St. Joan Rivers like?" he asked. "Is he an old man?" "No, he's young and handsome." "Do you like him?" "Yes, I do. He's a very good man."
And does he like you?
"Yes, I think so. He wants me to marry him."
And will you marry him?
"No, I'll not marry him. I don't love him." Mr. Rochester looked suddenly happier. He took my hand. He was silent for a very long time. And then he spoke.
"Jane, I can ask you again now. Will you marry me?"
"Yes, I will." I told him. At last I felt really happy, and Mr. Rochester too was no longer sad. 3 days later I became Mr. Rochester's wife. I wrote to Diana and Mary. The news made them very happy. I also wrote to St. Joan, but I had no answer from him. He went to India and continued to work very hard there. He never got married. Mr. Rochester and I are very happy together. We have been married for 10 years now. 2 years after we were married, Mr. Rochester began to see again with one eye. He'll never be able to see well, but he now can see me, and he can see our children. Our story was a strange and sad one, and terrible things happened to us, but now at last we are happy together.